The afternoon sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of Maple Street as Officer Derek Mitchell approached the modest Honda Civic, his hand resting casually on his weapon while his eyes scanned the woman behind the wheel with the kind of predatory assessment that had defined his 15-year career. Dr. Angela Washington sat perfectly still, her hands visible on the steering wheel, her simple blue dress and natural hair styled conservatively, giving no hint of the storm about to engulf the racist cop who saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see. "License and registration," Mitchell barked through the rolled-down window, his tone carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd learned that his badge gave him power over people he considered beneath him. But what Officer Mitchell didn't know, what no one on that sun-drenched street could have imagined, was that the woman he was about to humiliate with racial slurs and threats was actually Judge Angela Washington, the newly appointed federal circuit judge who had spent the morning in an unmarked car conducting a surprise evaluation of the very police department that employed him, and in exactly 23 minutes his captain would receive a call that would end his career and change the trajectory of justice in their city forever. If you've ever wondered what happens when prejudice meets its match in the most unexpected way, when someone underestimates the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment, then you're about to witness a story that will restore your faith in accountability. Hit that subscribe button and join the Acts of Depth family, because what unfolds when this officer's bias collides with federal authority will leave you believing in the power of justice served with perfect timing. Angela had been driving through the Riverside district for 2 hours, her trained eyes cataloging every interaction between police and citizens, every traffic stop, every moment where power met vulnerability. At 45, with coffee-colored skin that bore the fine lines of someone who'd fought for every achievement, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd risen from housing projects to federal courtrooms through sheer determination and brilliant legal mind. The unmarked evaluation was part of her new mandate as circuit judge, understanding the communities and law enforcement agencies that would appear before her bench. She'd chosen this particular afternoon deliberately, knowing that the Riverside district had been the subject of numerous complaints about racial profiling and excessive force. The statistics painted a clear picture of bias, but Angela had learned long ago that numbers on paper couldn't capture the full human cost of prejudice. She needed to see it firsthand to understand the daily reality that would inform her judicial decisions for years to come. The traffic stop had been routine. Angela had been driving exactly the speed limit, when Mitchell's patrol car had pulled behind her, lights flashing for no apparent reason. She'd known immediately what this was. Another case of driving while black in a neighborhood where her presence was deemed suspicious. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being profiled while conducting an evaluation of the very behavior now being demonstrated against her. Mitchell's approach had been textbook intimidation, the aggressive posture, the hand near his weapon, the way he positioned himself to assert dominance over what he clearly saw as just another black woman who needed to be reminded of her place. Angela had encountered men like Mitchell throughout her career, from law school classrooms where professors questioned her qualifications to courtrooms where opposing counsel assumed she was a paralegal rather than the lead attorney. "I said license and registration," Mitchell repeated, his voice growing sharper as he leaned into the window, invading her personal space with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions. "And step out of the vehicle. I need to search it." Angela remained calm, her prosecutor's training serving her well as she assessed the situation developing around her. "Officer, may I ask why you stopped me?" "I was driving the speed limit and following all traffic laws." Mitchell's face darkened at being questioned, his jaw tightening with the kind of rage that came from having his authority challenged by someone he'd already categorized as inferior. "Don't get smart with me, lady. I don't need a reason to stop you. This is my neighborhood, and I decide who belongs here and who doesn't." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path, and Angela felt the familiar steel settle in her spine, the same strength that had carried her through decades of fighting systemic injustice, now crystallizing into the kind of focused determination that would reshape this officer's understanding of power and consequence. The afternoon heat shimmered off the pavement as a small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. Residents emerging from their homes and stopping on their way to corner stores, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern and weary familiarity with scenes like this one. Angela noticed an elderly black man on his porch across the street, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he watched with the tense posture of someone who'd witnessed too many encounters that started exactly like this one. A young mother pushed her stroller closer to the buildings, instinctively creating distance between her child and the growing tension. While teenagers with phones began recording from various angles, their generation understanding that documentation was often the only protection available. Mitchell seemed to feed off the attention, his chest puffing with the kind of performative authority that turned policing into theater and citizens into unwilling audience members. "Everyone move along," he shouted to the gathering crowd, though his tone suggested he enjoyed having witnesses to his display of power. "This doesn't concern you." But Angela knew better. This concerned everyone because the abuse of power was a poison that infected entire communities, creating fear where there should be trust, suspicion where there should be cooperation. She'd seen the statistics in her briefings. Riverside had one of the highest rates of complaints against police in the state, with Officer Mitchell's name appearing on a disproportionate number of incident reports involving allegations of racial bias and excessive force. "Officer Mitchell," Angela said quietly, reading his name tag while keeping her voice level and professional. "I'm going to reach for my license and registration now. They're in my purse on the passenger seat." "Slowly," Mitchell snapped, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "And keep your other hand where I can see it. You people always try something." The casual racism of "you people" hit like a slap, but Angela had learned to transform such moments of degradation into fuel for the long fight for justice. She thought of her grandmother, who'd cleaned the courthouse where Angela now presided, scrubbing floors while dreaming that someday her granddaughter might sit on the bench instead of kneeling beside it. As Angela carefully retrieved her credentials, she could feel the weight of her federal identification card in her wallet, the document that would soon transform this encounter from a routine harassment into a career-ending catastrophe for Officer Mitchell. But she wasn't ready to reveal that card yet. She needed to see how far his bias would take him, how deep the rot went in an officer who felt empowered to treat citizens with such contempt. "This is a nice car for someone like you," Mitchell said, running his hand along the Honda's hood with deliberate possession. "How'd you afford it? Welfare check coming big this month?" The insult was designed to humiliate, to reduce Angela to a stereotype that would justify his treatment of her in his own mind. Angela had heard variations of this theme throughout her career, the assumption that her success must be unearned, that someone who looked like her couldn't possibly achieve anything through merit alone. "I work hard for what I have, officer," Angela replied, her voice carrying just enough steel to hint at the authority she wielded when not sitting in an unmarked car being profiled by a racist cop. Mitchell's laugh was ugly, filled with the kind of scorn that came from someone who'd never examined his own prejudices. "Work hard? Doing what? Collecting government assistance? Let me guess. You're probably dealing drugs out of this car, maybe running some kind of scam. That's usually how your kind gets money for nice things." Each word was a nail in the coffin of Mitchell's career, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Angela watched him dig himself deeper, documenting every slur, every assumption, every violation of the constitutional rights she'd sworn to protect when she took her judicial oath 6 months earlier. The crowd was growing, and Angela could see phones capturing every moment of Mitchell's performance, recording evidence that would soon become part of a federal investigation into the systematic abuse of power in the Riverside Police Department. A local news van had appeared at the end of the block, its reporter probably alerted by social media posts about another incident of police harassment. "I'm going to need you to get out of the car now," Mitchell said, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge as he sensed the growing attention. "I think I smell marijuana. That gives me probable cause to search." Angela knew there was no marijuana. She'd never used drugs in her life. But she also knew that Mitchell's claim of smelling something would be his justification for escalating the encounter. This was the moment where routine harassment often turned violent, where citizens' constitutional rights were trampled under the boots of officers who believed their badges made them above the law. Officer Mitchell, Angela said, her judicial training allowing her to remain calm even as her heart pounded with controlled anger. I want to be very clear that I'm cooperating fully, but I'm also documenting that you've made several racially charged comments and are now claiming to smell something that isn't there. Mitchell's face flushed red with rage at being challenged, and Angela saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. The look of a man who'd been enabled by a system that rarely held officers accountable for their actions, now facing someone who refused to be intimidated. The sun cast sharp shadows across the street as Mitchell's rage escalated into the kind of dangerous territory that had led to too many headlines about routine traffic stops turning deadly. His hand moved to his radio, calling for backup with the kind of urgent tone usually reserved for actual emergencies, while his eyes remained fixed on Angela with naked hostility. I need units at Maple and 3rd. Suspect is being uncooperative and may be under the influence. Angela recognized the language, the careful police terminology that would later be used to justify whatever happened next. Uncooperative, for asking questions about her constitutional rights. May be under the influence to explain the search he was about to conduct without consent. She'd seen these patterns play out in countless cases that had come before her bench, but experiencing them firsthand gave her a visceral understanding of how quickly legal harassment could escalate into life-threatening danger. 2 additional patrol cars arrived within minutes, their officers emerging with the kind of coordinated aggression that suggested this wasn't their first time responding to one of Mitchell's situations. Angela watched as they formed a semicircle around her vehicle, transforming a simple traffic stop into what looked like the arrest of a dangerous criminal. The growing crowd of onlookers pressed closer, phones held high, their collective breath held as they witnessed another black woman being surrounded by armed officers for the crime of existing in the wrong neighborhood. "Ma'am, I need you to exit the vehicle immediately," one of the backup officers commanded, his hand resting on his weapon. "Place your hands on the hood where we can see them." Angela complied slowly and deliberately, her movements careful and visible as she emerged from her car. The afternoon heat felt oppressive against her skin, but not as oppressive as the weight of 3 armed officers treating her like a threat simply because of Mitchell's lies and assumptions. She thought of all the defendants who had appeared before her court with similar stories, and how she'd sometimes wondered if they were exaggerating the humiliation they'd endured. Now she understood that no exaggeration was necessary. The reality was devastating enough. Mitchell began searching her car without consent, his movements destructive and deliberate as he rifled through her belongings with the kind of violation that left lasting scars on victims of police abuse. "Look what we have here," he called out, holding up her federal identification card with a smirk that suggested he had found exactly what he was looking for. But then his expression changed, the smirk fading as he actually read the words printed on the official document. Angela watched his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally terror as the full implications of what he'd done began to sink in. The federal ID clearly identified her as Judge Angela Washington, United States Circuit Court of Appeals, complete with her official photograph and federal authentication codes. "This has got to be fake," Mitchell said, his voice cracking slightly as he held the ID toward the sunlight, looking for signs of forgery that he desperately hoped to find. "There's no way this is real. You're trying to impersonate a federal judge." One of the backup officers, Detective Sarah Coleman, stepped closer to examine the identification. Angela had researched Coleman as part of her department evaluation. She was one of the few officers with a clean record and a reputation for integrity. Coleman's face went pale as she studied the federal ID, recognizing the authentic security features and official seals that couldn't be faked. "Mitchell," Coleman said quietly, her voice tight with the realization of what they'd stumbled into. "This is real. This is actually Judge Washington." The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow, his knees actually buckling slightly as he processed the magnitude of his career-ending mistake. Angela watched him struggle with a reality that his prejudices hadn't prepared him for. The impossible idea that the black woman he'd been humiliating was actually one of the most powerful judicial officers in the federal system. "That's impossible," Mitchell repeated, but his voice lacked conviction now. "She can't be a judge. Look at her, look at this car, this neighborhood. Judges don't drive around here. Angela finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority that had been there all along, now unmistakable once the official context was provided. Officer Mitchell, I am indeed Judge Angela Washington, and I've been conducting an evaluation of this police department's community relations. Your behavior today has been thoroughly documented. The crowd had grown larger, and Angela could see the recognition dawning on faces throughout the gathering. Phones that had been recording police harassment were now capturing something much more significant. A racist cop had just humiliated a federal judge, and everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that would have consequences far beyond this single street corner. Mitchell's hands shook as he held the federal ID, his career flashing before his eyes as he realized that every slur, every assumption, every violation of Angela's rights had been witnessed and recorded. The backup officers stepped away from him instinctively, distancing themselves from the toxic cloud of his impending downfall. The afternoon sun seemed to intensify as Mitchell stood frozen in the middle of the street, still holding Angela's federal identification as if it might transform into something less damning if he stared at it long enough. Detective Coleman had stepped several feet away, her radio crackling with urgent requests for their status while she clearly struggled with how to report what was unfolding. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, with more arriving every minute as word spread through the neighborhood that something unprecedented was happening on Maple Street. Angela straightened to her full height, and suddenly the simple blue dress and conservative hairstyle looked less like camouflage and more like the professional attire of someone who wielded enormous power with quiet dignity. Officer Mitchell, I need you to return my identification and explain to these witnesses why you stopped me, searched my vehicle without consent, and subjected me to racial harassment. Mitchell's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain apparently unable to process a reality where the woman he'd been humiliating with impunity was actually someone who could end his career with a single phone call. The other officers began backing away from him as if his poor judgment might be contagious, leaving him isolated in the growing circle of onlookers who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. Judge Washington, Detective Coleman said, her voice tight with professional mortification, I sincerely apologize for Officer Mitchell's conduct. The department will investigate this incident fully. Angela turned her attention to Coleman, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate how police accountability could work when officers chose integrity over loyalty to corrupt colleagues. Detective Coleman, I appreciate your professionalism, but this isn't just about one officer's misconduct. This is about a system that enables and protects officers like Mitchell while citizens suffer the consequences of unchecked power. The local news crew had arrived and was setting up their equipment, the reporter clearly recognizing that she'd stumbled onto a story that would lead the evening news and probably make national headlines. Angela watched the cameraman test his angles, knowing that within hours, Officer Mitchell's face would be broadcast across the country as an example of everything wrong with modern policing. Mitchell finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. Judge Washington, I didn't know. If I had known who you were, you would have treated me differently? Angela interrupted, her judicial authority now fully on display. Officer Mitchell, that's exactly the problem. Your behavior toward me was unacceptable, regardless of my profession or status. Every citizen deserves the respect and constitutional protections you denied me today. The crowd murmured its agreement, many of them recognizing themselves in Angela's experience. She could see faces that reflected years of similar encounters. Stops without cause, searches without consent, humiliation without recourse. But today was different, because today the victim had the power to do something about it. Angela's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and she glanced at the screen to see Chief of Police Robert Hayes' name. Word was spreading quickly through official channels, and she could imagine the panic in the police administration as they realized one of their officers had just committed career suicide in the most public way possible. Chief Hayes, Angela answered, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear. I assume you're calling about the incident on Maple Street. The chief's voice was strained with barely controlled panic. Judge Washington, I just learned about the situation. I want to assure you that Officer Mitchell's behavior does not represent the values of our department, and we will take immediate action." Angela looked around at the crowd of witnesses, many of whom were shaking their heads at the chief's words. They'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that Mitchell's behavior was far from unusual. It was just rarely directed at someone with the power to expose it. "Chief Hayes, Officer Mitchell told me this was his neighborhood and that he decides who belongs here and who doesn't. He subjected me to racial profiling, illegal search, and verbal harassment. But more importantly, his comfortable familiarity with these tactics suggests this is standard operating procedure, not an aberration." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for long seconds before the chief responded. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, and I want to assure you that we take allegations of misconduct very seriously. Officer Mitchell will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." Angela could see Mitchell's face crumble as he heard his suspension announced in front of the crowd that had witnessed his downfall. But she also knew that administrative leave was often just the first step in a process designed to protect officers rather than hold them accountable. "Chief Hayes, given the federal civil rights violations I witnessed today, this matter will be referred to the FBI for investigation. I'll also be recommending a comprehensive review of your department's training, policies, and complaint procedures." The weight of federal oversight had just descended on the Riverside Police Department, and everyone present understood that Mitchell's racist performance had opened a door that would be very difficult to close. The evening news that night led with helicopter footage of Maple Street, where yellow police tape now cordoned off the area where Officer Mitchell's career had died in broad daylight, the scene looking more like a crime site than a routine traffic stop. Angela sat in her chambers at the federal courthouse, the same building where her grandmother had mopped floors 60 years earlier, watching the coverage unfold across multiple news channels with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow for the systemic failures that had made this confrontation necessary. The video from witnesses' phones had been shared millions of times on social media, with hashtags like #JudgeJustice and #MitchellMeltdown trending nationally. But beyond the viral moment, Angela understood that real change would require sustained effort and institutional reform. The FBI had opened their investigation within hours, and the Department of Justice had announced a comprehensive review of the Riverside Police Department's practices, the kind of federal oversight that could transform how law enforcement operated in the community. Officer Mitchell had been arrested later that afternoon on federal civil rights charges. His perp walk broadcast live as he was led away in handcuffs by the same FBI agents who would normally be investigating criminals rather than the police officers who were supposed to catch them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. The man who had spent his career putting people in handcuffs now wore them himself, experiencing the powerlessness he'd inflicted on countless others. Detective Coleman had been promoted to lead the department's new community relations unit, her integrity during the Maple Street incident demonstrating the kind of leadership the department desperately needed. Chief Hayes had announced his retirement, though rumors suggested it was less voluntary than officially reported. The entire department was undergoing mandatory retraining on constitutional rights and bias recognition, with Angela herself designing parts of the curriculum. But the most meaningful changes were happening in the Riverside neighborhood itself, where residents who had lived in fear of police harassment were beginning to speak up and demand accountability. A community oversight board had been established, with rotating membership drawn from the very streets where Mitchell had once prowled with impunity. The elderly man who had watched from his porch that day now served as the board's first chairman, his weathered hands that had gripped the railing in fear now signing documents that would protect future generations. Angela returned to Maple Street 6 months later, driving the same Honda Civic at the same careful speed, but this time as part of a community celebration, recognizing the changes that had emerged from one racist cop's spectacular downfall. Children played in yards where parents no longer watched nervously for patrol cars, and community policing officers actually knew residents' names rather than seeing them as potential suspects. The young mother who had protectively moved her stroller away from the confrontation now approached Angela with a smile, her toddler running freely on sidewalks that felt safer than they had in years. "Judge Washington, I wanted to thank you. My son will grow up in a different neighborhood because of what you did that day." As the sun set over Maple Street, casting the same golden light that had witnessed Mitchell's racist performance. Angela reflected on the beautiful irony of justice served. A cop who had judged her by her appearance had been judged by his actions, and a community that had suffered in silence had found its voice through witnessing power held accountable. The federal ID that had ended Mitchell's career now sat in Angela's briefcase next to thank you letters from residents, police reform proposals, and invitations to speak at law enforcement academies across the country. Her grandmother's dream of dignity in the courthouse had evolved into something even more powerful. Dignity on every street corner, in every traffic stop, in every interaction between police and the people they served. Officer Mitchell had seen an ordinary black woman and assumed he could treat her with impunity. Instead, he'd encountered extraordinary justice, and his prejudice had become the catalyst for changes that would protect thousands of citizens from experiencing what he'd put her through. In trying to put Angela in what he thought was her place, he'd lost his own place forever, while elevating the very community he'd tried to diminish. The Acts of Death family knows that true justice often comes disguised as ordinary moments, waiting for the right person to reveal its power. If Angela's courage to transform humiliation into accountability inspired you, share this story with someone who needs to remember that every citizen deserves dignity and respect. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and remember, sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin when someone ordinary refuses to accept the unacceptable. In the end, the badge doesn't make the officer, the character does, and Mitchell's character failed him when it mattered most.